Everybody. I have the prestigious 8 o'clock Sunday morning position. I hope you have a little coffee and are ready to go. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, Marianne, for inviting me. This is a fun topic for me to talk about, into finding all kinds of different ways to assist families, which of course is good for them, but also good for their loved ones with BPD. There are hundreds of studies that tell us that there's a profound relationship between how individuals do, their individual well-being, and family functioning in the family in which they live. Hundreds and hundreds of studies. And in fact, there's been a large argument for 40 years about what direction this arrow is supposed to go, which is kind of silly because it just goes in both directions. That seems obvious, I think, to any family member that, in fact, being in a distressed relationship isn't good for the individuals in the relationship, and having a partner or a child or a parent who has severe individual psychopathology is tough on the family and tough on the relationships. Now, of course, the question is, how do they affect each other? What is that process underlying the transmission of individual distress to relationship distress? And what are the relationship factors, behaviors, actual things that happen in the relationship that then somehow create or exacerbate, or in other cases actually ameliorate suffering? So we know that's the case. We know this for many, many different disorders, and more recently we've learned this is true with BPD. So the question, of course, is why would we want to work with families? And one quick answer to that is, of course, because family members suffer a lot. In a study that Perry Hoffman, Melanie Harned, and I, and other colleagues are doing, we found exceptionally high rates of PTSD in family members of people who have BPD. Often the index episode, the index trauma, is around a suicide attempt. And I think you could imagine what it would be like to be a parent discovering that your child has made a suicide attempt. So that's a good reason by itself to work with families. And of course, another reason is that family members are frequently vilified, most severely by professionals, actually, and stigmatized. We might even have heard little wisps of that yesterday. And in fact, families want to do better. They want to be helpful. They want to do whatever they can, typically, to help their loved ones. It's also true that improvements in family functioning are a key pathway to better outcomes for the person with BPD. For example, in our study comparing dialectical behavior therapy to psychodynamic psychotherapy, this is a measure of family distress. As you can see in both treatments, family distress came down significantly. It seemed to hold up a little bit better in DBT. But regardless of the treatment, family functioning was fully mediating the outcome, which means that if family functioning didn't improve over the course of individual treatment, the individuals were far less likely to get better and to stay better. On the other hand, if family functioning improved as individuals got better, that tended to sustain itself. In other words, it's a kind of sine qua non. Without improving family functioning, the individual is at much greater risk either for not getting better or for relapsing. But it's also true that the family is simply the context. We have just so many studies that tell us that family interventions, often very brief family interventions, can have an enormous amount of impact on patient outcomes as well as on family well-being by itself. Now, the model in dialectical behavior therapy, which I'm not going to spend much time on, really is a transactional one, which, if you're coming from a family therapy background, is very familiar to you. It's sometimes called the family systems model, which is a bit different, but not very different. And of course, the idea is very simple. It's reciprocal causality. What I do has an impact on you. What you do has an impact on me. It's really no more complicated than that. How what I do has an impact on you and how what you do has an impact on me, that can be more complicated. But of course, I'm going to focus on the role of emotion dysregulation. Emotion dysregulation, as we saw yesterday out of all the factors out there, affective instability or emotion dysregulation, they're I think twin siblings, is the most predictive factor for individual outcome. In now our data, but as well as several other studies, emotion regulation or dysregulation mediates individual outcomes in treatment, again, regardless of the type of treatment it is. And emotion regulation seems to be a very important factor within families as well. So just quickly, emotion regulation for my purposes means, dysregulation means that the person focuses on the immediate reduction of their emotional pain, their aversive tension, or negative emotional arousal, however you want to frame it. It's a little bit like having a headache, right? So if you have a headache, you can kind of take it with you. You go to work, you can drive, you can make dinner, you can do whatever you have to do, go about your business. But at some point, that headache can become big enough that you can't take it with you anymore. You can't drive. It's too big. You can't cook dinner. You're not interested. You can't go to work. You can't focus. And at that point, the focus becomes, I got to get rid of the headache. Okay, so, but of course, instead of it being a headache, it's emotional pain. So emotion dysregulation is that line after pain where the focus becomes getting rid of the pain. You can't take it with you anymore. It's not just part of your experience, but something that's big enough that you've got to start to focus on, I got to get rid of this. I got to do something about this. And of course, our data tells us that this most often occurs in the context of important relationships. In relationships, when we get dysregulated, and by the way, this is not something that is limited to people with BPD. Anybody here ever say something mean to someone you love? Okay, we have to work on honesty, people. Okay, I will raise my hand. Okay, thank you, okay. I thought that New Yorkers were working on this thing, this is one of, so I just want to point out that when we say something mean to someone we love, that is a dysregulated moment, right? Because if later when our emotion comes back down, we kind of regret it. Sometimes we say things like, I didn't mean it. That's, by the way, another lie. We did mean it at the time. We just don't mean it now. That's a very different statement, right? I don't mean it now. I did mean it then is very different. Yeah, you big jerk. I did mean that, but I don't. Why did I say that? I don't think that's true now. So it's big. It's reactive. It's impulsive. We don't plan to get up in the morning. How can I be really mean to my partner or my kids? What can I do that would be a special gift of meanness today? That, we don't plan it. It's not our, something that we work on. We don't go to school to get better at it. It's reactive. It's impulsive. And in relationships, when we're dysregulated, we're typically either attacking the other person, some version of attack, or withdrawing. Our word for this is going to be invalidating. And of course, attacking has its own obvious negative consequences. Withdrawing is something in the psychotherapy world that often partners and parents are coached to do. But if you think about it, if you've got a loved one who's sensitive to to abandonment and social withdrawal, coaching the other person to withdraw is really very provocative. So actually withdrawing may not be such a great idea. Okay, so we have two roles here for emotion dysregulation. The first has to do with the person with BPD itself. And for that person gets dysregulated for a variety of reasons, many of which are interpersonal already. But even if they aren't, that person, when dysregulated, is typically inaccurate in his or her expression. Okay, the you big jerk, or what other flowery version of that you have, okay, is not accurate. Probably what's accurate is, gee, I love you very much and you just hurt my feelings. Okay? Somehow we don't say, oh, I love you so much and that's why it hurts. We say, you're a big jerk. You shouldn't do that, or something like that. So that inaccurate expression misses the boat. It doesn't explain what's going on, what the event was, what the emotional reaction is, what the person's wanting, which is usually a close relationship, a better relationship, not to push you away or to run away. And of course, inaccurate expression is difficult to understand. It can be confusing. I think, Mary, can I quote you? I think you said something that stuck in my head a long time ago, when patient said, you said to a patient, when you hit yourself in the face with a hammer, it's hard to understand that you're lonely, or something like that, It's like, that's not accurate expression, It's like, how do I get that from that behavior? So inaccurate expression could be verbal, but it can also be suicide attempts and drug relapses and other things, which aren't accurate ways of saying I'm profoundly lonely or whatever else might be a more accurate description. And of course, when the person's inaccurate and the other person doesn't understand, the family member doesn't understand, and it's very likely to be invalidating. Even if that person in his or her heart is very caring and wants to connect, wants to be helpful, if I don't understand, I can't be validating. And of course, we know that when somebody's invalidated, it exacerbates existing dysregulation. And of course, therefore, when one person is dysregulated, the other person gets dysregulated. So emotion dysregulation is very relevant for the person with BPD because it creates a dysregulated family member who's invalidating. But it's also the case that dysregulation is relevant for a family member. Family member gets dysregulated, it's difficult to pay attention to the other person. What I would call relational mindfulness, what I think is very, very close cousin of mentalizing, which is being able to pay attention to the other person, know what the other person's experience is, what the other person's thinking or feeling or wanting, and how it's connected to but different from what I'm thinking or feeling or wanting. And that lack of being able to pay attention to the other person, of course, leads to an empathic failure, an inability to understand, and sometimes a complete misunderstanding of the person with BPD, which leads to invalidating responses, criticism, attacking, withdrawal, or just simple benign invalidation, which of course pushes the other person's arousal up even further. So you can see there's a pattern, a reciprocal pattern of dysregulation that can get established. We did a study, we've actually done this, this is a study with just a cross-section of people. And what you see here is that we stress people out in a very benign way. We give them problems to solve that are impossible to solve. We just don't tell them they're impossible. We're a little bit sadistic, but that's kind of what makes it fun. So we stress them out, and that works. And this is a cartoon slide. So when we talk about stress, negative emotional arousal, we measure this both in terms of self-report, but also a variety of physiological indices of stress. Skin conductance, vagal tone, heart rate reactivity, variety of things. So they get stressed out, and what they don't know is that the person who's conducting the experiment has been randomly assigned to either validate or invalidate them about their emotion, not about their job on the task. And as you can see, and then of course they continue to get, through the course of the experiment, they continue to get problems they can't solve. They get every single problem wrong, 100% wrong. But what happens is if they get validated, even as they're getting the problems wrong, their arousal comes 2/3 or 3/4 of the way back to baseline. It's soothing to be validated, even though they continue to perform very poorly. Their negative emotion about their performance goes down. Whereas if they get invalidated, they can't. Their arousal stays high. Now, we replicated this, of course, with a sample of people with BPD. The pattern looks exactly the same. The only real difference is the people with BPD, their baseline arousal starts much higher. They just walk into the experiment already with more negative emotional arousal. Okay, so when we're working with families, the basic idea, of course, is that we want to do something to try to help regulate emotion in order to block the attacking and block the withdrawal. That's the basic idea. We're trying to help regulate emotion to create more accurate expression and more validating responses. Now, this morning I'm going to talk just about skills and weaving skills into whatever family session that you might have, whether it's a single session, you have one opportunity to work with a parent or a partner or a other loved one, as opposed to an ongoing program. I'm just going to talk about skills. Of course, there are a lot of other things we can do, but I just don't have time to talk about all of those. But skills per se are a target for a variety of reasons, not least of which is that they're extremely empowering. Skills create choices. If you can ride a bicycle, you have something else you can do to go to work. If you can't ride a bicycle, you don't have that choice, that's all. It doesn't mean you don't have other choices, it just means you don't have that choice. So every skill we have creates a new choice, a new opportunity, and with enough skills, we begin to feel very empowered. There's something we can do in situations. It's very practical. Skills, focusing on skills, is also non-pathologizing. It's non-pathologizing of the person with BPD. It's also non-pathologizing of the family, of the loved ones, because Well, gee, if it's I just don't know how to do it, I just don't have that in my repertoire, that's different than being a motivational or characterological deficit. We don't see with skill training the idea is like, oh, what's your motivation? You have, some ugly motivation for this. No, it's just you don't have the ability to do it differently in that situation. A little bit like, thinking about learning to drive a car, but you live in San Diego, right? And where San Diego is, I'm choosing that because it's always 72 degrees there, right? There's never any ice. You might be a very good driver in San Diego, but then if you move to, say, Rochester, okay, or Syracuse, you might not be such a good driver a couple of months of the year, right? Now, you can see that as a motivational deficit. You're not trying very hard, or you could see it as, gee, you've got a skill in one context, but you don't have it. It doesn't transfer to another context in which you need it. So skill deficits are non-blaming and don't end up with a kind of character assault. Of course, it also means everybody's responsible for his or her own skills. And we don't get into accountability. There's no accountability. No, we're all accountable for our own behavior. We've all got to learn how to manage ourselves in the context in which we live. And of course, as a learning model, the idea is we have to learn the skills in the situations in which we need them. It's very accessible and valid. There's loads of studies, literally hundreds of studies about skills in families and individuals. Not so many in BPD, but a few. And they all point in the same direction. Skill training also focuses us on the fact that there are multiple sources of dysfunction, okay? Lots of different things along the way that can end up in an argument or not talking to each other for an evening or a week or a month or 5 years for that matter. Sometimes I have families who come in and haven't spoken to each other for years. There are all kinds of sources of dysfunction along the way that can be reframed as a skill deficit. There's lots of ways to think about these things. Of course, no one is the right way, but a skill deficit is a very non-pathologizing, descriptive way of doing it. Okay, so the set of skills I want to focus on has to do with managing our own emotion, and of course that would be for the person with BPD, but also for any other family members interacting with that person. Also, the mindfulness of emotion and goals, awareness of, gee, what am I feeling? What am I thinking? What am I wanting? What's the larger context? To tell somebody you love that they're a big jerk, or whatever version you have of that, you have to forget for a moment that you love that person. If you could hit there are a lot of movies where you have a remote control, you hit the pause button and everything stops. I think it all goes back to a Twilight Zone with Burgess Meredith, but that's another story. If we hit the pause button for just a second, just as you're about to say you're a big jerk, and you say, now wait a minute, what's that going to get you? And you just waited till arousal came down. Nobody, if you just kind of remind, oh, wait a minute, I like this person. I love this person. I want to have a good relationship with this person. What I'm about to do is not going to facilitate that. If we just remember this is a person we love, it's very hard to be very attacking, very invalidating. It's difficult to do that. In fact, our motivation to do that goes away. So if we can become aware of our emotion and our goals and the importance of the relationship, that can point us in a very different direction. Of course, if we're aware of our emotions and our goals, then we can express ourselves accurately. If we express ourselves accurately, it's easier for the other person to be mindful of us. To pay attention to the other person. And of course, if we understand the other person, it's easier to validate. So I'm going to focus on these, these particular skills. But I also want to note that there are other skills that you sometimes need. If you've got parents of younger kids or adolescents, and sometimes even young adults, very specific parenting skills might be needed. And in couples, there may be more specific skills around closeness and intimacy that they can benefit from. But for today, I'm just going to focus on that first set. So the idea is that, to summarize, is that or to flip it around, when our emotion is moderate and regulated, we are able to be mindfulness. We know what we want. We're aware of the importance of the relationship with the person in front of us. And we're aware of our emotion, and therefore we're able to express ourselves reasonably accurately. Okay? when this happened, I felt that, I want something, okay? When we do it in an accurate way, a non-blaming, non-attacking, and accurate descriptive way, it's pretty easy for the other person to understand. If the other person isn't dysregulated, the other person can pay attention and listen. Listening is relatively easy. That's at least possible. And by paying attention and listening and not being dysregulated, if we understand, it's easy to validate. And of course, from our other slide, we know that if we get validated, that's very soothing to our arousal. And when it soothes our arousal, of course, it makes us more aware of what we're thinking and feeling and wanting, which makes it even easier to express more accurately and descriptively. And this cycle just kind of goes around. And I think if you have a good relationship with somebody, in those moments when the relationship is enjoyable, you're probably doing a lot of this, probably quite naturally. Well, of course, the idea behind skills is that instead of doing it automatically, when we break down, we actually have the skills to do this purposefully so that it becomes automatic again in a new situation. So the San Diego driver who practices long enough living in Syracuse, driving on ice in the winter, can drive on ice in the winter without having to purposefully think about what to do. That person understands what he or she needs to do differently when the roads are icy. So it becomes automatic to be more skillful. So we fondly call this opening your mind before you open your mouth. The idea is that many family interventions go right to communication, but in family skills work, we go right to regulating our emotion. And right to focusing on what we bring to the conversation is actually probably at least as important as trying to focus on saying something different. It's really experiencing it differently. So there's a big focus on self-regulation, self-awareness, then being able to bring attention to the other person. And we try to do all of that before anybody speaks. Good luck with it too, right? It's not so easy. All right, so a couple of therapeutic considerations. Now this may be obvious, I hope so, but it's very important to like your clients. I say this because I encounter colleagues on a regular basis who I think don't like some of their clients, whether they're individual clients or their clients' family members, partners, parents. It's extremely important to like people, because if we like them, and I mean that very sincerely, liking the person, then we can be lighthearted, we can be playful, we can block them in a kind way instead of a frustrated way. And people will tolerate being blocked and redirected so much better if they feel like they're understood and liked while doing it, instead of just being slammed because they're doing something wrong. So liking people is actually pretty important. It's also important to be able to see that whatever problem behavior, and we work with some pretty chaotic and messy families where people are not always on their very best behavior, but it's important to see that thing that's right in front of us right now has a long history. There's a lot of things that have happened that have contributed to the current misbehavior, the current dysfunctional behavior, the current you're a big jerk, whatever that particular behavior is. There's a long chain of events and behaviors that have contributed to that. We don't have to know necessarily what that chain is, but we have to know it's there. Behavior occurs for a reason. It's not because it's a bad person. It's not because of a character deficit or because of, at least in this way of thinking, some sort of unconscious desire to annihilate somebody. It's because of a long chain of events that led to that moment. So seeing that chain makes us more empathic without diminishing our commitment to helping people do it differently. And then finally, it's also very important to be able to make sure that you make family members look good. As therapists, we get lots of training and supervision and practice at being validating, at paying attention to other people, and trying to discern what they're thinking and feeling and wanting. And we're pretty good at figuring that out and saying it. Often much better than dysregulated family members. Plus, they aren't our family members, so we aren't as reactive to them as we might be to our own families. So it's easy to make the other person look stupid or incompetent. Like we can validate warmly and look like, just riding in on a horse, It's very important not to do this. Unlike an individual treatment where there may be value in a very deep empathic understanding and a warm validating response. In family work, we've got to be careful to make sure that we don't do that, to show up the other person in the room. We want the parent or the partner to look good. The purpose of our being there is to help their relationship, not our relationship with them. There are a lot of ways to do that, but it's important not to show off how easy it is to validate. Well, sure, if you don't have anything, if they're not your family member, it's a lot easier. Okay, so the first thing we have to do, of course, is to help each person manage his or her emotions and reduce their reactivity. And for this, of course, emotion skills, attention skills, and managing emotion distress, distress tolerance kinds of skills can be extremely helpful. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I suspect that you know how to do this. This is the bread and butter of DBT. There's lots of skills to help people manage their emotion using emotion regulation skills and distress tolerance skills and mindfulness skills, a whole variety of things to modulate emotion physiologically, cognitively, and behaviorally. I'm not going to spend time on this because this is the more common part of it, but I want to go to the next step, steps towards accurate expression. So first of all, in order to express ourselves accurately, we have to be aware of the larger context. Why am I opening my mouth? What am I wanting to get from this transaction, from this conversation? Am I just giving you a piece of information? I worked with a couple a while ago, and they came in one day, and she said, you know, he's just so hostile. And so as we do in family therapy, we try to figure out like what happened, what was the sequence of events, and try to do a redo, kind of try it again. And she said, you know, she made a lovely dinner, his favorite dinner, which I think was a steak or something. And he said, the first thing he said was, "You please pass the salt." And she looked at me. Please pass the salt. I said, okay, so you're going to have to explain this to me. He says, well, he's just being hostile. I said, okay, you need to explain that to me. And he says, well, he knew damn well that that steak was perfect. I made it exactly the way he wants it. And so I kicked her out of the room for a moment. Okay, this is actually one of the things we do. We have a revolving door, which I'll explain later. And I said to him, okay, you got to come clean, because if she's right, it's going to be completely crazy-making to say, you know, that all you wanted was a little salt. And he sat there for a moment, and he just looked at me, and finally he says, damn it! I said, what do you mean? He says, yeah, I didn't really need the salt. She was completely right. It was just a 100% hostile act, okay? Just, he knew he was enjoying the steak, he didn't want the salt, but he knew that it would be hurtful to her if he asked to pass the salt, and he thought he could get away with it. Like, what? I didn't mean anything by it, honey. So, I couldn't make this up. I'm not that creative, okay? So, at that moment, of course, the idea was to think about, like, could he be mindful of his long-term goals? Like, why is he wanting to be hostile in this way? What's that about? What's going on about that? Is that really going to get him what he wanted? And, of course, his hostility came from a conversation that had happened, 30 minutes prior to that, which she was unaware had a negative impact on him. But he was very upset by something she had said. So could he be aware of his long-term goals with her? Could he have done something different? Like, if he really was aware, wait a minute, I love her, I want to have a good relationship here, he wouldn't have chosen to do it that way. It would have been a different way. And of course, even if you're not motivated by the quality of the relationship, sometimes we're motivated by self-respect. At the end of the day, when we look in the mirror, can we say, you know, I did the best I could in this situation, even though it didn't go well, I did my part of it. And because we, of course, can't control a transaction, we can only manage our own part of the transaction. We can influence the other person, right? What I do has an impact on you, and what you do has an impact on me, but there are other influences as well. So we could do a pretty good job, but it still might not work out. We also have to be able to identify what we're thinking, feeling, and wanting and paying attention to, in particular our primary emotion, the emotion that's connected to what's going on. Sometimes called softer emotions, or I like the term primary emotions, like Greenberg and others talk about. If we can identify those and those are connected to events, they're easy to understand. If we can identify those and stay regulated, okay, then we can be descriptive, stay in reality, and express ourselves accurately, okay? Then we can simply describe when this happened, this was my emotion, or this is what I wanted, this is what I was thinking, all of the above. Because they're naturally connected to the event, it makes sense. It's easy to understand. So for example, simple example, if, let's imagine if I'd been in a car accident a couple of weeks ago, kind of nasty little gut, somebody ran a red light, and so I'm not driving because I, hurt my back or something, and you, my dear friend, are taking me to physical therapy. So for the first time, and this was a couple weeks ago with this car crash, and so I go, you stop to pick me up, and I go to get in your car, and I start to shake. Okay? What do you say to me? What's my emotion, first of all? Fear, right? Okay. Is it justified? Do you say, oh, you're right, you have every right to be afraid. I am a lousy driver. You are at great risk right now, right? Like, is my fear justified by the present moment? No, but it's justified because of my recent experience, right? And most people, I'm not making this complicated, right? This is not like a trick question, right? You would say something like, wow, that must have been a pretty awful experience. In other words, you would, as a validating person, connect my fear to the event that precipitated the fear, right? My car accident 2 weeks ago, not look around to see if somebody's chasing me in my driveway, right? You would connect it to the event. That's the way the fear makes sense. Okay, now, in that situation, it's obvious to you. But what if it's not? What if, I'm hostile at home, but the event had to do with something at work, right? The event seemed to be, the salt, who knows, right? It could something else. It's very hard to understand because it's way down the chain. It's many steps removed from what the event was. It's hard to understand unless the person explains it. Gee, I'm upset about this because this is what happened. Well, that makes sense. So by being able to connect our feelings and our emotions and our desires and our thoughts to the events, it's easier for other people to understand. And accurate expression then is the big step here. But of course, in order to do it, one has to be regulated. The next step in this transaction, of course, is if one person is expressing accurately, and I would argue that any piece that's accurate is going to be helpful. Any piece is going to be helpful. The whole thing, it's rarely in chaotic families or distressed families, it's rarely going to be right away a simple statement of this happened and this is my emotion that all makes sense. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of things that have gone on for a long time that are influencing, just like the car accident might influence my fear of driving in certain situations for a long time and might recede, the connection might recede. I make new friends who don't know about the car crash. They may not understand why I'm an anxious person and riding in the car. But I could explain it, okay, but that's the accurate expression. People might misattribute that anxiety, that fear to something else, like something they're doing, like that I'm suggesting that that person is a bad driver. No, it's just that I'm a bad rider because of my car crash, okay? So relational mindfulness means that the other person, after being regulated, staying regulated so that there's enough energy, enough lack of arousal to get in the way, the person can pay attention and bring that attention to the relational context. This is somebody I care about. I actually want to understand, want to have a good relationship. I love this person. And that's the motivation to pay attention even when it's difficult. Notice the suffering, develop a little bit of an empathic connection without blaming, just being aware, what's going on, what are you thinking, feeling, wanting, okay? And that full attention to what that person's experience is, to what that person's saying. When we notice a discrepancy, okay, between maybe what the person's saying now and what the person said before, we can approach that with curiosity. Gee, I noticed the last time you said X, now you're saying Y. What's different? Instead of you're not being consistent. Well, that's one way to shut you down, right? I mean, yeah, I might not be consistent, but there are reasons for that. Let's figure that out together. I hope you want to understand it. So bringing full attention to the other person, and then allowing our own emotions gently to respond to our awareness of the other person. In other words, when our arousal goes up quickly, we want to shut it down, right? It's like touching a hot stove. As soon as we do it, we want to back away, okay? If we had more power, we'd want to, like, I think, hit the stove, you know, and a lot of people do. They'll slam something on it. So when the other person says something that pushes our emotion up, we might have a tendency to want to shut that person down. That, of course, is not going to facilitate their accurate expression. Instead, we have to manage our emotional response to what the other person is saying, because the other person might be saying something like, you're unhappy with me. I did something that upset you. I could easily, we might have had 1,000 arguments like this that didn't go well, so my arousal's going up. I don't like that. I don't like that kind of argument. I feel blamed. Wait a minute, wait a minute, you just said that you're unhappy about something. Okay, that's not quite an attack. That's different. That's not an attack. Well, what are you unhappy about? What could I do differently? So relational mindfulness sets us up to truly understand. Plus, if the other person is not being 100% accurate, relational mindfulness allows us to notice things we don't understand and ask about them, be curious, and sometimes even to fill in the blank. Sometimes we can understand things the other person isn't even telling us if we're empathic about it. So what do you notice when I show you this picture? What do you notice in your own emotion? Any emotional reaction to that? Yeah, kind of a positive emotion? Yeah. So I am. You can use the M word. I'm being manipulative, okay? I am. Right? Another, I've got a goal here, right? I mean, so if you're a parent, okay, or somebody who's ever had a parent or met a parent, you know, you might start to think, oh, that's kind of sweet, or, you know, you might notice this and have some kind of positive emotion. So, but rather, instead of a picture, we might ask parents to carry around a picture of their child when the child was a toddler, okay, or school-age kid, or some sweet picture that reminds the parent, wait a minute, this is somebody I love, even though this person is now 28 and driving me crazy and, you know, digging through my wallet when I'm not looking to go buy drugs with my money. You know, I mean, that could be very upsetting. And this is a person that I love. They could both be true. And of course, if it's a couple, you know, like something about your relationship. What's the glue? What's the motivation here to do something different? We'll encourage parents to go crack the door open when their child is sleeping and just look through the door at the child sleeping, which of course is connected to things that most parents do when their kids are very small, babies and toddlers, which often elicits a lot of love and care. We want to remind ourselves that those connections are there, that the motivation is there. We do a lot of work around trying to create some cues to remember the quality of a relationship that's there, the desire for a relationship that's there, in order to be able to focus attention from that position of motivation instead of the position of, I don't want to get slammed, I don't want to be attacked, I don't want to, you know, attack back. Now, as a therapist in this session, it's important, as we're trying to get people to be more skillful, manage their emotion, express themselves accurately, pay attention to the other person, it's important to block everything else, okay? Now, the good news is in family therapy, which is actually quite different than most versions of individual therapy, there's a very active role for blocking. There's no point in allowing people to practice dysfunction in our office. They can do that at home for free. And they can do it over and over again at home for free. They don't need to practice that in front of us. So we want to block things like quick fixes. You know, when people come in, you know, and you ask what would they like to see, usually the first thing they say is change the other person, right? That's usually the first thing. That's probably not going to work. We don't go straight to problem solving. Some family therapies do. If solving the problem were that easy, they'd have figured it out. People are fairly intelligent. They can manage this. It's not the problem that's the problem. It's not being able to solve the problem that's the problem. Okay, it's the process that's the problem. We block invalidation. Okay, it's a tongue twister. You have to block even invalidating invalid things. Okay, like invalidating the invalid is a valid thing to do, right? Like if my loved one says, "Oh, you just hate me, don't you?" Well, let's assume that I don't, right? That in my heart I don't. I love my child, my spouse, whatever it is. The tendency would be to say, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. That's not true." Well, that didn't help. That didn't help at all, right? I was simply invalidating the invalid, but the person's not open to that. I have to validate the valid first before I can invalidate the invalid. I have to validate the valid a lot before I can invalidate the invalid. Okay? So I have to start by saying, oh my gosh, is that what you're thinking? I had no idea. That must be so painful to think that I hate you. What a terrible feeling that must be for you. Yeah, it is. Oh my gosh, well, I feel terrible too because of course that's not what I feel. Okay, so we validate 3 times, 4 times, and then I can invalidate the invalid. I can say, that's not true. Of course I don't hate you. But I can't just start there. If I start there, the person's closed, there's no openness, it has no impact. In fact, it just feels invalidating, because it is. It's invalidating the invalid, but it's still invalidating. Nobody really likes being invalidated, even if it's invalidating the invalid. I've been practicing this for years. Okay. So we have to block that. Of course, we have to block invalidating valid things, and we have to block validating invalid things. You get the idea. Anyway, we also need to block defensiveness and blame. Just shut it right down. Just interrupt. This is why we use a revolving door. My office, the person in the office next to me sometimes accuses me of being a drug dealer. He says, you know, there are people coming and going from your office so much. The only possibility is that you're dealing drugs. What can I say? The idea of the revolving door is that if one person is dysregulated and can't stop attacking the other person, the attacked person doesn't need to hear it again. We send the attacked person out and we help regulate the attacking person, and then we invite the other person back in to hear it differently, okay, from a more wise and balanced and regulated perspective. It's very different to say, you know, I really love you and you hurt my feelings than, you know, you're a complete expletive, you know, fill it in. So we want to block defensiveness and blame. We want to be very careful about coaching timeouts, especially withdrawal due to emotion. I typically want to do that because it feels like it's an abandonment to say, okay, so I'm upset, I'm going to take a timeout. That's often very provocative for the other person with BPD, so we don't typically use those kinds of things. We actually encourage people to say, can we stop talking for a few minutes? Okay? Or if the timeout is, take a timeout, but take it in a very brief way, like I need to go to the toilet. I'll be right back. Okay? That doesn't seem so scary and awful. I can go to the toilet. The person can go to the toilet and splash some cold water, you know, in the sink and take a few deep breaths and come back, and then it's not as provocative. We block judgments, whether they're like, oh, I'm such an idiot, or you're such an idiot. Either way, it's not helpful. We block judgments that are masked euphemistically. We hear things like, that wasn't respectful. That's a judgment. I mean, what that really means is that you hurt my feelings, or I don't agree with you. That's really what that usually means. That's not fair. That sounds like a description, but it's not. It's a judgment. Fairness is a judgment in these contexts, almost always. I'm not saying there isn't such a thing as fairness, right? But in a conflict situation, when somebody accuses the other person of being unfair, it's almost certainly a judgment. That's not really the issue. And of course, we have to block mismatched responsibility. What that means is that sometimes people either themselves perceive a sense of responsibility that is way beyond how much influence or control they have, or the other person wants the person to do something that's way beyond their ability to influence or control. We can only have responsibility for things we can actually do, things we have control or influence over. I can't be responsible, say, for doing a task that I don't know how to do. If I'm not a firefighter, and the house down the street is on fire, and I don't have the skills to do something. I can only be responsible for doing what I can do, which is maybe calling the fire department. I don't know how to, I don't know how to open up the fire hydrant. Well, I do, but I don't have the tools for it. That kind of stuff. So, responsibility commensurate with control. Okay, now validating and invalidating responses are in some ways easy enough. However, sometimes people mistake validating for positive and invalidating for negative, and they aren't the same thing. Validating and invalidating behaviors, when we do research and we look at family interactions, parent-child, partner-partner, doesn't matter, and we rate validation, and then we go back and rate the same conversations with positivity and negativity or other ways of thinking about it, validating and invalidating account for more variance. They're actually more powerful predictors of what's going on than positivity and negativity per se. And positivity and negativity in couples and family research are the hallmarks of good research, like positivity, negative, but actually validating and invalidating responses way surpass positivity and negativity for predictive power. And it's probably because the occasional example where something is very positive can also be very invalidating. So for example, worked with a family where one of the parents had made a series of suicide attempts, and the other parent was really afraid that this one was going to be dead. And when the suicidal person said, I feel really bad that I've really let you down, that I've really left the entire management of the family to you for the last year, which I thought was a great statement. This is like stepping up and being validating, and it was accurate expression. But the partner just said, "Oh no, you do plenty, And of course, I knew that she wasn't thinking that at all. That wasn't what she was thinking. Like you're right, but if I say that, I might upset you, and then you might go kill yourself. That's what she was thinking. So, but that's very invalidating to say, "Oh no, sweetie, you do a great job." It's very warm. It's very positive, but totally invalidating, because in fact he knew very well he had not stepped up. He knew very well that he had completely jumped out of his responsibilities, and he wanted to do it. He wanted to find a way back in to doing his part. And so that was very warm, very loving, and very invalidating at the same time. And of course there are examples of not very positive things that can actually be validating. And so we're looking for validating and invalidating as opposed to positive and negative. Okay, you don't have to actually be able to say this, much less say it fast, but you have to know validating. Think of it like multiplication. Validating the valid, positive times positive. It's a good thing, right? Invalidating the invalid, a negative times a negative. That's a positive. That's a good thing, right? Validate the invalid. No. Invalidate the valid. No. Positive. No. Okay, you get the idea. Okay. So, the idea, of course, is to find a validating response that's matched to the way that something is valid, right? So in my car crash example, if you're my loved one, you wouldn't say, "Oh, honey, of course you're afraid. I'm a terrible driver. That's not why I'm afraid." You would say, "Gee, it seems like, you're still reeling from the accident," right? You'd connect my fear to what was the event. You'd connect it. It's valid not because it's dangerous now, but because I've got a conditioned reaction now. I've got a conditioned fear response. That's the way it's valid. It's not valid in the present. There's no present danger. Okay? So we have to connect the way that something's valid and validate that way. So if my teenager I thought was going to bed at 11 o'clock, just instead went and got on the internet and played Dungeons & Dragons until 3 in the morning, I actually am making this up. My teenager doesn't do that, to my knowledge. And then, of course, at 6 o'clock, I'm waking him up and saying, "Hey, honey, it's time to get up for school." And he says, "Oh, I'm too tired." Saying, "Oh, honey, you're tired. Oh, well, then you stay in bed." Right? You stay in bed. That's okay. What's the problem with this? Right? I'm validating the invalid. Right? Not valid for a high school student to stay up all night playing Dungeons and Dragons and then miss school the next day. It's not going to work very well, right? What is valid about that situation, however? He's tired, exactly. So I could validate, wow, you didn't get to sleep till 3. Wow, no wonder it's hard. It's really hard to get up on 3 hours of sleep. Wow, you must be exhausted. Now get your sorry ass out of bed, okay? Right, so, right, because that's also valid, right? Like, and you got to do it. This is part of the task of developmentally, and I'll help you. I'll make you some breakfast. You get out of bed, I'll make you. So there's a lot of things we can do, but we got to validate the valid parts while blocking, or dare I say, invalidating the invalid. Now, there are a lot of ways to do this. If you've worked with families, you know that often in families there's a communication gap where one person is just so much more verbal than another. Not all the time, but in many families, it's not uncommon to have a teenager who's just way more verbal than the parents, or one partner who's more verbal than the other. This is an automatic problem in family therapy if the focus of family therapy is on big talk, big conversation. But if the focus is on understanding each and supporting each other and validating, we don't have to be so verbal. So in fact, we have, what I fondly think of as the disyllabic responses that we teach people, like, I know, I see, I understand. Okay, just like you don't have to be super verbal. The other person can blah 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 blah. For complete paragraphs, it's like, I know. It's enough. Okay, great. You don't have to keep up. It doesn't have to be 50-50. It makes sense. I got it. Okay, sometimes that's enough. Okay. Real curiosity when we don't get it. When I don't understand, when the other person's expressing something that I don't understand, what happened? You've got a lot of emotion. I don't know what it's connected to. I don't see the event. Help me understand, where's that coming from? What happened? With genuine curiosity, not a challenging kind of, okay, what happened this time? That's not a genuine, open, curious what happened. And sometimes just the great big, of course, the very soothing, of course. You'd feel this way, think this, want that, whatever it is. Anybody would feel that way. I would feel that way too. That's telling the person that their response makes perfect sense. It's completely normative. It's not because the person has some disorder. It's just normal. Anybody would feel that in that situation. And then sometimes there's the me too, okay, which sounds like a disclosure, me too, but that's the, if you went out on a date, let's say I'm happily married. I'm not in the habit of dating these days, but if I went out on a date, let's imagine I'm in my 20s and I go out on a date, and at the end of the date, the other person says, I had a great time. I hope we could do this again sometime soon. Well, I could validate by saying, I know you had a good time. Or, makes sense. Of course you did. You were with me. This is not really probably what's required. What's required is a me too, right? Because the other person's in a vulnerable situation. We have to match that person's vulnerability by also being vulnerable. The other person's climbing a little bit out on the limb. We got to meet that person out on the limb. Me too. Now, in families that are distressed, it's not usually like, oh, me too, I love you too. Although that's a nice thing to do. It's more like, in the middle of an argument, the person says, wait, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to have this argument again. I don't either. Okay? Instead of, well, if you weren't such a jerk, we wouldn't be having this argument. No, that's not really, the person's made him or herself vulnerable. That's not the time to lance forward. It's the time to step back and say, me too. I'm part of this reciprocal transaction. Now, in the session, I'm just going to, Marianne said, I have 2 more minutes, is that okay? Yeah, okay. We use a variety of strategies. I talked about the revolving door. We also can stop and do a relationship mindfulness practice right in the moment. We have dozens of these things. ET mindfulness, where people put out their pinkies, their fingers, and touch each other's fingers, and it's actually just it makes people focus. Wait a minute, there's a human being here. It changes things. We just get people to do the practice right in the room. And although it's completely against every rule of psychotherapy, in family therapy, sometimes we speak for somebody in the room. we say, you know, the person does a good job expressing accurately and the other person's tongue-tied, we might say, you know, gee, your parent, of course, completely understands. Of course, it completely understands. That makes perfect sense to your mother, father, partner. And usually the other person kind of nods. So it's like they're owning it. It's just they're not quite able to articulate it yet. In the process of developing these skills, sometimes we speak for them, either expressing something accurately the person's trying to get out or validating in a bigger way than the person can do yet. We also sometimes involve other people. You know, you might have had this experience where, you know, best friend, sister, brother, grandparents, somebody else, siblings, somebody's getting in the way. You know, the parent says, you know, I really want to do this, but then somebody else is telling them, you know, I can't believe you let your child do that, or I wouldn't stand for that from my partner, and it kind of gets them off the track and not acting in ways that are very helpful. So sometimes we just haul those people in and try to help the family that we're working with express what do they want, how can the other people in their social network help them, their goals, not just because the other person might not stand for it, this person wants to stand for it. So involving others. Lots of blocking and redirecting, lots of coaching. And then last but not least, I want to come back to this idea of being irreverent and playful, including humor. In a way, when we're playful, we're only playful with people we like, first of all. Okay? So it works both ways. If we can get ourselves to be playful, we might find ourselves liking people more. And that's a good thing in family therapy. If we can get ourselves to like people in a different way, that might allow us to be more playful, which is a good thing. Playfulness not only is very good for the therapist, by the way, because it keeps us regulated, which is good to have a regulated therapist, but it also is a little bit contagious, right? So in the family, if we're a little bit playful, it's sending multiple signals, one of which is that, you know, this is very serious, and we can like each other, which is, of course, one of the main problems that the family is almost certainly having, which is they're in an either-or sort of bifurcated world. Either we love each other and treat each other really well and never make a mistake, or everybody's a mess and everybody's doing everything wrong. But in fact, we can really care about each other, love each other, and sometimes we're not on our best behavior. Sometimes we say things that aren't our best moments. They can both be true, and can we hang them both out there? Okay, so I think my time is up. I hope that this has been a little bit helpful. If you're interested, of course, I didn't talk about the research. We've got several studies, basic research studies on these transactions and these skills, outcome data, a variety of things. If you're interested in the data, please send me a mail. I'm happy to send you stuff. If you're interested in more information about how to conduct family therapy in this way and family skills, I'm happy to send you some papers about those things. Okay, thanks very much. Right. So this is the sort of the worry about the walking on eggshells phenomenon, if I'm understanding you right. Right. So if you're very sensitive, the idea is I'm worried. Gee, if I have to tiptoe to kind of keep you regulated, then I'm maybe reinforcing your sensitivity. But that's not the target here. The target would be to be able to be myself with you, but continue to like you. So you're sensitive, say, "Oh, sweetie, that's not what I meant," and then give you a hug and say, "No, of course that's not what I meant," and then and continue to interact with you in a pretty reasonable way. I'm sensitive to your sensitivity, but not so much that I have to walk on eggshells. You know. And I think that, you know, sometimes a family member might say, well, don't use that word. Well, I'm not going to stop using that word just because you don't like the word. But I could certainly validate that it's hard for me to use the word. You know, it's like, you know, there's lots of things. I can be validating and still do the thing that's important to do. So this doesn't create a situation of increasing reciprocal sensitivity and tiptoeing around each other. That would be terrible.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.